Hey, love, you are listening to the No Boss of Me podcast, and I'm your host, Leanne Hanaway, money coach, wealth educator, and chartered professional accountant. This is a show that helps ambitious women grow and invest their money without shame, worry, or doubt so that they can live the life that they love. Every week, we will be discussing investing to build wealth, navigating personal finance as women, and talking with women entrepreneurs and change makers who are leaving their mark on our world. Without further ado, let's get into it. It's been a hot topic. It's been in all the news headlines, and it's probably all over your social media feed. The question of what is inflation? In today's episode, we will draw back the curtain and understand what the concept of inflation truly is and how it may or may not impact you as an investor who is building generational wealth. Together, we are going to explore the idea of inflation in a way that is jargon-free and non-reactive. We are not going to be answering any questions like, what should I do? How should I react? Or how I should respond to this latest noise in the headlines dealing with inflation. Oftentimes, being reactive can be a mistake that many people make when approaching topics like inflation in the world of personal finance. Sometimes you get caught up in the news of the latest interest rate hike, or worse, speculation about interest rate hikes, because you kind of want that crystal ball as to what may or may not transpire in the future. However, my hope is that for this episode, you will allow a moment to zoom out and look at the concept of inflation through the lens of building your financial literacy muscle. To do so, we are going to break down this discussion into 3 parts. Part 1, what is inflation? What causes inflation? Part 2, how is inflation measured? And part 3, what are the effects of inflation on different types of assets? All right, are you with me? Because it's about to get started. Part 1, what is inflation and what causes it? Some define inflation as too much money chasing too few goods. That description is pretty cute, it's pretty bite-sized, but it's a description that overly emphasizes the demand side of what causes inflation. So rather than describe it as too much money chasing too few goods, the more technical description is that inflation takes place when the growth in the money supply outpaces the growth in the economy, and this results as a decline in purchasing power for a given currency. In other words, goods and services cost more than they used to. Simply said, yesterday's price is not today's price. So if the cause of inflation is a growth in the money supply that outpaces the growth in the economy, then the next obvious question is, how does the money supply grow? There are 3 common ways that this can happen. Number 1, the money supply can grow from the printing and issuance of new money. Number 2, the money supply can grow when the government decides to loan new money into the banking system by purchasing government bonds. And number 3, the money supply can grow if a government decides to legally devalue the currency. So, in addition to these 3 ways that the money supply can grow, let's go over them: printing money, loaning money, or legally devaluing money. Another element we need to consider when it comes to inflation is the velocity of money. The velocity of money is the rate at which money changes hands, essentially the speed of transactions throughout an economy. So when new money is pumped into the system, but everyone decides to hide it under their mattress, or in the digital age, keep it in their savings account, this doesn't create the same inflationary pressure. It doesn't really cause prices to go up. The supply of money is an attribute that the government can directly control. However, the velocity of money can only indirectly be influenced through mechanisms that create or detract from consumer and investor confidence. We're going to go into the three common mechanisms that either create or detract from consumers' and investors' willingness and the velocity to spend money. So the first mechanism takes place when demand outpaces supply. This is called demand pull inflation. When people have more money, it leads to positive consumer sentiment. This in turn leads to higher spending. You got the money, you want to spend it. And this in turn allows prices to go higher. It pulls prices higher. The demand for more goods means that the fewer goods that there are, suppliers will price their goods higher. In other words, people who have more money are going to want to spend it, but the production capabilities can't match that demand. When that happens, the demand outpaces supply, and we end up in a situation where we have too much money chasing too few goods, resulting in higher prices. That is called, again, the demand pull inflation. The second mechanism is called cost push inflation, and this occurs when the cost of producing products and services rises, forcing businesses to raise their prices. This usually happens when there's some disruption that makes the cost of raw materials or the cost of production rise. And the downstream effect is that it increases the cost of retail goods and services to me and you as consumers. For example, we might be talking about raw materials such as copper or lumber or even the cost of steel. If there is some disruption either in the acquisition of raw materials or the processing, the transportation, the production capabilities, the supply chain capabilities, then the producers of those goods in the middle face longer wait times and higher cost. And of course, this gets passed down to you and me, the end consumer. So again, this is cost push inflation, which increases prices. And so the last and third mechanism is known as the wage price spiral. This takes place when prices begin to rise, which means that life gets more expensive as a result. Workers and employees will demand higher wages to keep up with rising prices. Businesses will raise wages and raise salaries in order to meet that worker demand and in order to attract and retain talent. And businesses then have to raise their prices of their own goods and services in order to pay their higher labor cost. This creates a self-reinforcing spiral known as the wage price spiral. Now, if those three mechanisms that we talked about sounds familiar, it's because this is the story that we've all lived over the past 2 years. On the demand side, when we went into lockdowns in 2020, services like concerts and massages and haircuts, well, those services were no longer available. Consumers then turned their demand away from services towards goods. In addition, stimulus checks and enhanced employment benefits grew the supply of money and kept consumer confidence strong, further fueling this demand for goods. However, at the same time, the production capabilities and the supply chain capabilities for producers to create those goods could not meet this added demand. And lastly, in addition to that, in many sectors, in order for producers to be able to increase their production capacity, they also needed to make very large capital expenditure investments that require a long lead time. So you can hear already that we were talking about demand pull inflation as well as cost push inflation. But on top of all that, we also talked about the wage price spiral. The wage price spiral was also a factor that we've experienced in the last 2 years. In the last 2 years, there also was a labor shortage, either by force or by choice, Because folks needed to homeschool their children, they needed to care for ill or elderly family member or even themselves, or they received enough in various forms of non-wage payment that they could afford to opt out of the workforce. So the labor shortage amplified the wage price spiral. So what's happened in the last 2 years is that when we talk about these three mechanisms that fuel inflation, again, demand pull, cost push, and wage price spiral, there have been no other economic inflationary periods where all those factors have driven inflation. Usually, there have been inflationary periods where one or two of these factors have driven inflation. This brings us to the end of part one. What is inflation? So let's recap what we discussed. Inflation is an increase in the cost of goods and services and a decrease in purchasing power of a given currency. And it happens when the growth in the money supply outpaces the growth of the economy. The money supply grows through printing and issuance of new money, through the loaning of new money into the system, and through legally devaluing a currency. The money supply, however, is just one of two factors that influence inflation, with the other one being the velocity of money. So both the supply of money and the velocity of money play a role, and they play a role through three mechanisms: either demand pull, cost push, or wage price inflation. All right, so let's move on to part two. How is inflation measured? Inflation doesn't happen universally across all sectors of the economy at the same time. So, in order to measure inflation, we have to track a diversified basket of goods and services. Two such baskets that are used in Canada are the CPI and the other one being the PPI. Let's talk about each one of these in turn. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, represents changes in prices as experienced by Canadian consumers. It measures price changes by comparing through time the cost of a basket of goods and services. The goods and services in the CPI basket are divided into 8 major components. They are food, shelter, household operations, which also includes furnishings and equipment. Number 4, clothing and footwear. Number 5, transportation. Number 6, health and personal care. Number 7, recreation, education, and personal care. And lastly, number 8, alcoholic beverages, tobacco products, and recreational cannabis. CPI data is published at various levels of geography, including Canada as a whole, the 10 provinces, Whitehorse, Yellowknife, and Iqaluit. CPI is one of the most widely used measures of inflation. The all-item CPI and its subaggregates can be used to calculate a price change between any two periods, with the most commonly used calculation being a 12-month percentage change. For example, the CPI index increased 6.9% in September 2022 from a year earlier, compared to a 7% increase from the previous month. So that is to say August 2022 versus August 2021. So this really suggests that inflationary pressures are receding, although very, very slowly. Sometimes items which constitute such a big chunk of the basket of goods and services in coming up with CPI can throw the numbers off. Specifically, I'm talking about food and energy. A little bit of a decline in gasoline prices can be offset by a huge increase in prices for food. Changes in price, particularly for the cost of food, fuel, oil, and gas, can be impacted by a whole bunch of factors, including political factors that don't necessarily reflect inflation. For example, Statistics Canada, which measures CPI, attributed the increase in September food prices to poor weather, higher fertilizer and natural gas prices, and to, quote, geopolitical instability, unquote, resulting from Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Both of these two sectors, being food and fuel, are pretty volatile and can have an outsized impact on how CPI is measured, even though it might not reflect inflationary pressures. So there's a measure that sometimes we use, and it's referred to as core inflation. Core inflation is the measure of CPI minus food and energy. Core inflation looks at price changes across that same diversified basket of goods and services, except that it removes food and energy in order to mitigate the impact of these volatile sectors. Excluding food and energy from CPI, inflation rose 5.4% in September from the year earlier, and that compares to 5.3% for the previous month. Is this a better way to measure inflation? Well, it's subject to debate, but certainly it just gives us another data point to round out the picture. And another data point that is often used is what is known as the PPI, or Producer Price Index. This measures the average weighted price changes sellers receive for intermediate goods. The CPI looks at inflation from the perspective of retail buyers like you and me, whereas the PPI is looking at inflation from the perspective of sellers and producers. Now, if you go to the Statistics Canada website, you will see that the PPI is published on a ton of different commodity price indexes for goods and services. When I went there, I actually looked up one for accounting service price index. So it actually measures the change in accounting services prices over a given period. It's easy to see that there's a lot of different ways that you can measure inflation. And in particularly this one, it offers another insight in how we can round out and measure and monitor inflation. We don't really hear about PPI as much as we do CPI in the news. It's clear that CPI usually gets most of the headlines. But when you're looking at any of these measures of inflation, you really want to center the discussion around two different things. One, how much has it gone up? And two, how fast is it continuing to go up or hopefully go down? Anytime you are measuring any type of change, you don't want to just look at the month over month numbers. So, how was it in September compared to August, for example? But also, you want to look at the increase and decrease of those numbers over a given time frame. So, just bear this in mind when you see a headline about CPI. You can look at the most recent reported change, but also how that change compares to the rate at which it's been changing. Clear as mud. So to recap highlights from part 2, we talked about how inflation is measured. We talked about the CPI, the PPI, and a measure that is sometimes referred to as core inflation, which is CPI minus food and energy. All right, let's move on to part 3. What are the effects of inflation and how does it impact different types of assets? So let's start with the good news. The effects of inflation are desirable. We do want to see some degree of inflation in our economy. Inflation spurs investment because it requires investors to look at various types of assets like equities and commodities and real estate in order to beat inflation. Inflation also spurs spending because knowledge that cash today will be worth less tomorrow is a motivator for consumers like us to spend money now. So it's healthy for society to have a small, controlled degree of inflation. Even at the best of times, inflation needs to be managed carefully. People in general will shrug off short-term changes in prices if they believe inflation will remain relatively low in the long run. In this case, business as well don't immediately raise prices, and consumers continue to spend and to borrow. Their confidence that inflation remains low helps keeps inflation low by allowing the economy to stabilize after short-term bumps. This is called a normal inflationary environment. High inflation means prices are climbing very quickly, and your dollar that you have doesn't stretch as far. If incomes don't increase along with the prices of goods and services, everyone's purchasing power goes down. People will buy less, the economy starts to slow. High inflation can mean that people who have saved for their retirement may find they have less money than they expected. Businesses and consumers must spend time and effort trying to protect themselves from the effects of rising cost. So if high inflation is bad, deflation, where prices are falling, obviously must be good. No, this is not necessarily the case. A drop in some prices can boost demand for those items, but in general, a persistent fall in prices is usually a symptom of a deep problem within the economy. When people lose their jobs, they spend less. And then firms experience diminishing sales and they lower prices. People will postpone major purchases because they think that prices will continue to fall. As more money is saved, less money is spent, prices fall further, and economic activity shrinks. So, even in a falling environment where prices are lowering, it's also not good for the economy. In 1991, the Government of Canada and the Bank of Canada agreed it would be good for Canadians to have low, stable, and predictable inflation. An agreement was made with the Bank of Canada for them to be responsible for bringing down inflation to about 2% and then keeping it within 1 to 3%. To achieve this target inflation, the Bank of Canada may raise or lower its key policy interest rate. If inflation is above 2%, the bank may raise the policy rate. This prompts other banks, like our major banks or credit unions, to increase the rates on their deposits, on their loans, and on their mortgages. The higher interest rates encourage saving and discourage borrowing, which in turn discourages spending. In response, companies increase their prices more slowly or even lower them to encourage demand. This reduces inflation. Lower interest rates work in much the opposite way and can help increase inflation if it's too low. The bank focuses on price changes that are more widespread and persistent, the ones that could push inflation away from the target for a while. So, if you've been noticing an increase in prices on just one of those baskets of good, it might not trigger the Bank of Canada to change their interest rates in order to move prices overall. This is because any changes that the bank makes in its policy interest rate will take some time to affect people's spending. The bank announces its interest rate about 8 times during the year, and the next one is scheduled for announcement on Wednesday, October 26th, which is actually the publication date of this episode. So, with the Bank of Canada setting the overnight rate, let's look at how, in turn, that impacts inflation and assets on borrowers, on savers, and on investors. When money enters the economy, in most cases, it's lent out by the banks to businesses looking for loans and to consumers, such as retail home buyers. The companies and the people who are able to get these loans are poised to benefit significantly as inflation rises. For example, housing is generally viewed as a good asset when it comes to inflation. This is in part because the value of the property will rise with inflation, and in part because the asset was purchased using borrowed funds. So, inflation is very good for borrowers, particularly borrowers with fixed rate loans, because when you borrow money at a fixed rate of interest and the rate is less than the rate of inflation, over time, when you repay that loan, you're using cheaper and cheaper dollars. So, not only do you own an asset, but as a borrower, you experience a double win. The asset goes up, and you're also repaying the debt with cheaper and cheaper dollars. These assets are typically called inflation hedges. In contrast to tangible assets, paper assets like cash and bonds, these are usually the types of assets that are eroded by inflation. That 1 to 2% that you get on interest in your checking account or your GIC is usually less than the rate of inflation. So, in an increasing interest rate environment, you can do less and less with the money that you have in the bank. That can greatly impact those who are on a fixed income, such as seniors or the poor, and low income families who may not even have any savings, but are seeing the impact on their very dollar as higher prices are given to goods and services. And in particular, those goods and services tend to make up a larger share of their income. Now, let's talk about what the impact is for investors in an inflationary environment. Broadly speaking, stocks have historically also been a great hedge against inflation, but not all stocks are created equal. Stocks can be divided into numerous categories, but for this discussion, we are going to look at growth and value stocks. First, growth stocks. As the name suggests, growth stocks refer to equities expected to grow at a faster rate compared to the broader market. Generally, growth stocks tend to outperform during times of economic prosperity when interest rates are low. For example, we've seen this with technology stocks, where they have significantly outperformed in recent years because they've been fueled by a robust economy and have had access to cheap capital, so low interest rates. Conversely, value stocks trade at a discount to what the company's performance might otherwise indicate. Typically, these are more attractive in terms of valuations than the broader market already suggests. Value stocks can be found in financial sectors, healthcare, and energy. They tend to outperform during periods of economic recovery because they can usually be relied on to return stable income streams. Swings that we're seeing in the market right now and declines that we've seen in major companies in the market over the last few months, much of that has to do with investors that are repricing these stocks in the market and reassessing what they're willing to pay for the prospect of future returns on these investments in light of increasing interest rates and an increasing highly inflationary environment. You might see in that growth stocks. So again, those stocks that usually profit from a lower interest rate environment have been more heavily repriced than value stocks, the ones that can be depended on for a reliable return. So let's bring this all together. In an inflationary environment, borrowers with fixed rates, as well as value stock investors, tend to do better than others. Those others being those with variable rate debt and those that are savers as opposed to investors. The greatest takeaway that I want you to think about is that inflation is not transitory. It actually is here to stay. Sometimes we might be in a high, a low, or a normal inflationary environment. But our current economic environment highlights the usefulness of putting your financial plan together and a plan that provides for long-term wealth that will weather the ups and downs of inflation. And if you want to learn more about wealth building, I encourage you to go to leannehanaway.com/masterclass live. That again is leannehanaway.com/masterclass-live, where you can attend my masterclass on building long-term wealth through investing. This masterclass is totally free and it will give you tons of valuable information on how to build wealth with confidence. So let's recap what we've talked about. In part 1, we defined what is inflation. We discussed the causes of inflation, and we related this to everything that has transpired over the last 2 years. In part 2, we talked about how inflation is measured, the CPI, the PPI, and a measure referred to as core inflation, which is the CPI minus food and energy. Lastly, in part 3, we talked to some degree about how inflation is desirable, and that it's normally set at a target of 2% here in Canada. Even still, inflation needs to be managed carefully because the impact of inflation is not felt equally across our economy. It can impact individuals very differently. And in that, we talked about how inflation can be bad for some people and good for others. And lastly, we talked about the impact of inflation on growth versus value stocks. So, where does this leave us? As I said at the beginning of this episode, the intention was to explore the concept of inflation in a way that is jargon free and a way that is non reactive. Your wealth building strategy is personal, and it shouldn't be influenced by a handful of news media headlines. Nothing in this episode should suggest that you go about buying a home right now, even if you're not ready for it. Likewise, if you've been saving up for a major short term goal like travel or maybe going back to school, this is not the moment to treat the stock market like a high yield savings account and throw your cash in there, despite the fact that you know you're going to need that money in a short time frame. Rather, I hope this episode has laid a foundation for you to understand and discuss the term of inflation, a term that we will constantly hear in the news these days. But even in hearing it, you won't necessarily change, accelerate, or reduce your financial investment strategy based on the fears that you are hearing. What I want you to do is to make sure that you have that wealth building plan in place. And I am here to help you on your wealth building journey. This has been another episode of the No Boss of Me podcast. I'm Leanne Hanaway, money coach, wealth educator, and chartered professional accountant. If you have feedback on today's episode, don't forget to rate us and review us wherever you get your podcast. You can also DM us on Instagram at nobossofme. We'd love to hear from you. Please join us again next time for more on investing to build wealth, navigating personal finance, and talking to women entrepreneurs who are changing our world with confidence. Thanks for listening.